Hi guys, and welcome back to this week's episode of Let's Chat Ethics. I'm your co-host Ariana.
And I'm your other co-host Amanda.
And this week we're going to be discussing the very controversial firing of Timnit Gebru from Google. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, Timnit was the co-lead for Google's Ethical AI Research Center and has been a real pioneering, remarkable woman in this space and has done a lot of amazing work that she's renowned for. And some of that is actually pointing out the bias in facial recognition. And she's co-authored and authored many research papers for people who are working in this field. So this firing has really hit the community hard. And with that, there has been absolute outcry of support for Timnit, and rightfully so, from, you know, people, academic institutions, other tech companies all over the world. Honestly, my Twitter timeline was filled with people speaking out against Google and in support of Timnit, and a lot of people, other people coming forward talking about their toxic experience of working at Google and how they've kind of been censored and silenced. And I think, again, for someone who isn't aware of the situation, basically, in a nutshell, Timnit had been a co-author on a paper that had pointed out certain issues that Amanda's going to get a bit deeper into, such as bias and environmental impacts of large natural language processing machine models. And then in turn, her paper was rejected and Google said they didn't want to publish it. And yeah, basically it kind of all rippled from there. And then her boss, Jeff Dean, went on to kind of forcibly push her out of Google, which has led to the situation we're in now. So yeah, I mean, it's just kind of shown the real toxic work environments that a lot of Black women face, and anyone who's trying to speak out against bias is then kind of censored, like we're experiencing now. And it also trickles back into our episode a few weeks ago where we spoke about big tech and big tobacco and funding, and how can we ever really trust research that's coming from big tech or being sponsored by big tech, and how can we know it hasn't been censored or filtered? And here is a clear example of this happening. But yeah, I think it's just been an absolute crazy week, and I personally want to send my support to Timnit, as this situation has been extremely toxic. But I like I was saying, the positive side is that I have no doubt that she's going to go on and work and do amazing things and has an amazing support network. But yeah, what were your thoughts on this, Amanda?
So I have a few thoughts on this. Part of it, so relating to what you just said about how many people have shown support and are willing to risk their own jobs and their own livelihood to support Timnit, gives me a little bit of faith. So I think a lot of the comment generally, like the criticism that tech people get, is that people in tech don't care about ethics, and maybe this is a little show that we do. So that's great. Obviously, the firing is terrible, to be clear. But the outpour of support, I think, is really great and gives me positive vibes for the new year, I think.
I agree.
But in terms of sort of what happened and the story of the firing, there's a number of problems here. So obviously the way the firing was done, it seems like she was never told officially that she was fired. They just terminated her account, and that's like beyond AI ethics. It's just not the right way to treat an employee. But I was reading an article on the MIT Review about the paper that got her fired, essentially, and what the paper was saying. And one of the key points in the paper is that large language models are really bad for the environment. And I think we've talked a little bit about language models in the past. So a language model is a way to represent a language as a series of vectors. So what you do is you take the biggest data set you can get of examples, and you train a model to do something, and you actually extract the vectors from there. So the idea behind them is that you can understand words based on, like, the meaning of words based on the words that they're commonly used with. And so based on that, you learn the relationship between words and sort of an idea of their meaning. And there are relationships, and I think I talked about it before in the bias episode, that you can do like arithmetic operations on these vectors, and that's very useful and has certainly helped to advance the field of NLP. But in Timnit's paper, I'm assuming actually there's more co-authors, so they talk about the massive cost that training one of these has. So keeping in mind that the systems the language models will be trained more than once during development, just training it once uses like the amount of CO2 it produces the same amount of CO2 as like 5 American cars in their entire lifetime, and that's just to train it one time. So for development's sake, like, this is pretty bad for the environment. And beyond that, like we talked about in the bias episode, they obviously also have bias, right? So if you're training on corpora of English, that's likely going to be racist because we have a history of being racist, and that's the data that we have, and the fact that we're using these models for research, then you can see how that's problematic. So another problem that they point out is that these language models, although they're a good model for language and a good way to kind of manipulate it and test certain things, they don't actually extract the meaning of language. So just because you know that the word cup often appears near coffee, it doesn't give you the actual meaning of what a cup is. And so this is kind of misguiding research, if that makes sense, right? So you're not, if the point is to get to artificial intelligence, then you will eventually likely need to understand or build a system that actually knows what a cup is when you're talking about a cup. And this focus that we have on language models is kind of taking us away from that. And maybe if we could actually understand language properly, we would probably potentially get better results on smaller data sets or more curated data sets, and so maybe that would use up less energy. And finally, the last problem they point out is that with these language models, because they're actually really good at mimicking human language, there's too many opportunities for them to, or the probability that they can actually be used to fool people is too high. And we've seen this before. So for example, there was in the article they talk about a college student who auto-generated self-help and productivity advice on a blog that went viral, and obviously people were reading this as though this person had written it themselves, not an AI. So just to sum up what the points of the paper was that training these large language models uses a ridiculous amount of energy and produces a lot of emissions. And this was based on a paper that was published, I think, last year, maybe in 2018, but it made quite a lot of waves in the community when it was published. And especially at a time where researchers are more concerned about CO2 emissions. So especially because of COVID right now, a lot of conferences have moved to being online, and Some high-profile researchers are arguing that this is better because we save, obviously, the CO2 emissions of not having 5,000 people traveling to one place to go to a conference. The other problem in the paper was that these language models are learning from, obviously, biased data, and so everything that we build based on these language models will be biased or racist, sexist, etc. Then the third problem is that the language models don't actually understand language. They just model it. And so we might be moving away from more useful, better research that, well, one will be maybe less energy efficient, but will actually maybe get us closer to actual artificial intelligence. And finally, the fact that these language models are actually so good at mimicking human language that they can be used to fool people. So that was a long description, I guess, of the paper. But I think probably, having said that, going back to your question, Rihanna, my thoughts about this was that this is clearly a good example of what we were talking about, I think, a couple of weeks ago, about how companies can bias the research that is getting done and not done and what's getting published. And this is a good example of research that clearly companies like Google, which, by the way, produce a lot of the huge language models that we have, and that a lot of researchers use, obviously don't want people to be too concerned about what the cost of training these models are, as well as pointing out other problems.
Yeah, I think it made me think of what we spoke about with big tech and big tobacco and the research funding a few weeks ago, which Timnit actually tweeted about a few days before her firing, about how basically she tweeted, is there any protection, and there should be protection and legislation in place for AI ethic researchers who are either working in big tech or are working and discovering things about big tech, and there should be some kind of protection. And that before she even got fired, that got me thinking. I was like, yeah, after what we spoke about the other week, there should be some protection in place, because how can that research ever be authentic? Because as she was saying, that you obviously constantly face a lot of barriers in these workplaces, and if you're being funded by big tech, you're going to be going to them saying, I've made this discovery, and they might not want you to publish that. So how can it ever be really the genuine kind of nuanced research that we actually need? And obviously there's obviously pros and cons to working in big tech, but I think this is an example of, like you said, they haven't wanted to face the cost or the risk, and they don't really want to be associated with that kind of, I guess the environmental cost is a big one as well right now, especially, we're living in 2020 and the environmental issues are becoming clearer and more real. So to have that kind of research published, I think would be seen as extremely, obviously, negative towards such a tech company. But yeah, I think, this whole thing is very, very shady from Google, really. And like you said, the way they went about firing her was awful, really, and I think just so disrespectful. Like, so just for someone who's worked in that space. And I think the thing that made me think is even worse, in my opinion, you might be working in something, I don't know, like oil, that might not be the most ethical type company, or I don't know, but to be working in Google's AI ethics research department, and there's a whole like center created by Google for ethical AI, to then treat someone who's the co-lead of ethical AI. I think when it comes to ethics, it all comes down to trust as well. How will, like, we, as in we, the population, ever trust Google again? Like, quite frankly, my opinion of Google has been shattered down to a different level. I thought that Google was doing some really pioneering research, which obviously have got people doing that. But I think it's also very disappointing because it's going to then make people question that research even more. So people in Google who are doing pioneering research within Timnit's department, now everyone's going to be double questioning how real is this research that we're seeing? How has it been influenced? But yeah, and also to what you were saying, though, I do think this did give me faith, though, in how many people actually were supporting her. And I think within the tech community, there are so many great people. I think it's just the corporations can be the devil, not the people. The people are power. Power to the people, but I think
Oriana's anti-tech company rant. I think we've come to that part of the episode.
It's always a way, but well, I just think big corporations in general, like, they're big corps, aren't they? But power to the people, because that's what those are the people who were supporting her. And I think it's been really nice to see how many people have actually wanted to confront these situations, and people who are working at Google who are tweeting about what's happening. I think that's actually really, really brave, and I actually really admire these people, because you are potentially putting your job at risk.
Yeah, I have really loved the output of support that she's received. I don't know, I think so often I worry as well that techie people are not so into the ethics thing, and I think it's really going to be key if we're going to get ethical AI, to have the people who are building the AI to be into ethical AI, because there's no other way than to build it into the system, right? But going back to the sort of the CO2 and the green gas emissions, I think it's really interesting because it's one of the guidelines that we still have to cover, actually. And there's been more and more emphasis on that. And I think, when that paper came out, I feel like it might have been in 2018, there was a lot of talk about just how not only is it expensive to train these models, but it's not very green. And a lot of people don't want to talk about that, even though, like I said, it's one of the EU's guidelines, and that's, I don't know if maybe companies should be made to buy carbon offsets for every model that they train, or if, I would actually agree with Timnit that the solution is going to be to move away from language models as much as we can, at least from these enormously large ones, because these language models really are just huge. I mean, you're trying to capture all of English into one language model, and I do NLP, that's my area, and these language models have done amazing things, and every time a new one comes out, it's super exciting to see how much better different tasks are, how the accuracy and the precision, etc., increases in all these different tasks. But at what cost? And if ultimately we're not really getting to quote unquote solve language, then to what extent are they actually being all that helpful? It's a question that we should ask ourselves, and because we should instead be focusing more on sorry, Brianna, continue. Oh yeah,
no, it's fine.
I was just going to say that maybe we should focus more on building better, more curated models, like she suggested, and that would definitely help, I think, probably with the racial bias and the sexism and other kinds of bias that we might not have thought of in these data sets. Like, they're just full of bias. It's very, and they're not easy to debias, right? So there was, even though there's been papers published on how to debias these language models, there was also a paper published last year or the year before showing that the debiasing methods actually just hide the bias. They don't remove it. So
I think when I think of the environmental impacts of these like large language models, that's something I guess, I mean, it is spoken about in AI ethics, but not maybe to the extent it actually should be. And when you think about it, when we were speaking before about like Western, like, you know, like different like cultures and how these all things impact in AI ethics, but we don't really maybe think about the impacts of how a lot of AI is being used in more developed countries who have money to be able to incorporate AI into different systems into their daily lives. But yeah, it's again, at what expense and at what costs are we getting this AI? Because think about it, the environment is declining. Like global warming is a real issue, and realistically, again, this only at the moment is mainly affecting developing countries. So like farming, crops, like getting watered down, certain islands in the Pacific like actually sinking. And yeah, the environment is actually a very, very real issue. And again, to what extent are these big tech companies, and it's not just tech, when we think of AI, any big corporation has their, you know, global footprint with emissions. But obviously in this case, we're talking about the big tech. And yeah, these large language models, I think there needs to be a point where we weigh up what's really the benefit. What are we using this for? And what knock-on effects is having on our environment? Like what costs and what expense? And I think that's a clear, I think that's clearly a really good point that her and the co-authors have pointed out, and that's something that should be published and should be, and you know, companies using, like tech companies using large language models should actually think about how they can actually make this more environmentally sustainable, because clearly up to this point it's not. And on to your point about bias, Amanda, I think what I was most shocked and like horrified about was the fact that Google are firing one of their most profound like ethical AI researchers, who is a Black woman, and she's into building one of the most diverse teams in tech. So for her to have been building such a diverse team who have been able to be doing this pioneering research in ethical AI that obviously is tackling and trying to tackle bias, it just kind of astounded me that Google then went and fired her. And what does that really say about Google's mission to fight bias? Because what obviously we've spoken about before, in order to mitigate bias in any kind of language model or any kind of AI, you need people who are from different backgrounds and from different races, etc. Like, you need a diverse team. And I don't know what that's saying about Google's kind of mission towards ethical AI and actually wanting to mitigate bias if they're going to fire Timnit, who is, you know, a really pioneering Black woman who has done amazing research in this field. And I think it's really, really sad because, like I was saying before, how are her team who have seen this happen not going to feel a certain way and not going to feel worried about their jobs? And how are they going to be able to feel like they're going to be able to do research and talk about bias or any kind of issue that may arise and not have the same thing happen to themselves? And I think that's obviously a worry, and I think it's kind of sending a really kind of dark message and worrying message from Google, really. And it's just it's very sad to see, actually, but it just shows this treatment of Black women is, you know, not just a sole issue in tech, but it's just another example of a Black woman being treated badly very, very publicly.
Yeah, but I'm thinking that this isn't the first AI ethics related shit show at Google. Like, didn't they a couple of years ago fire their entire ethics board?
Yes, they did. It just seems is there a lot of undercover stuff going on in Google that we don't know about? Like, a lot of very dodgy AI work, because there must be.
And who is making these decisions? Like, these seem to be like PR disasters. Like, wouldn't it have been better to say, hey, language models are horrible and we need to be more careful. So here's a paper outlining all these problems, and now we're going to be looking at, maybe solving these problems. So maybe Google could put their efforts towards building smaller language models, or actually working towards truly understanding language. I don't think the paper in and of itself would have been such a PR disaster for Google. I think it was actually a very worthy paper, and the findings about the carbon emissions, they're not actually findings from Timnit herself. Like, this was a paper that was already published. She's just basing, like, the outline, the problems that she's outlining are based on the findings from that original paper. So, I think it would have been good for Google to be like, hey, we're actually publishing this research. Like we were talking about when Amazon published the fact that their hiring software was biased against women, and they were like, oh, we're going to scrap it. Google could have spun it into, hey, there's this massive problem with AI not being green. Because I think, they have a lot of people who are vegan working there, and all of, a lot of Google employees do care about the environment. So, yeah, it's just a disaster.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. That's when me personally, I have like way more respect for like big tech when they are a bit more transparent. Like you were saying with Amazon being like, actually, okay, well, this has happened and this is what we're going to do about it. And I just don't understand what went on and why they would think that it would be a sensible idea to fire someone who is really, really obviously valued within the AI and AI ethics community, and is clearly really respected for like her research and for what she's done. It just seems crazy, like you said, that there was so many other ways they could have dealt with it. They could have just been transparent from the get-go. And I know something that everyone's been kind of upset about, I've seen on Twitter, is the fact that the guy who fired her, I've forgotten his name, I think it's Jeff something, but yeah, that he then put out a statement that everyone is accusing him of lying, actually, and saying, oh, Google's has a policy of 2 weeks with the peer review and X, Y, and Z. And there's been loads of people in Google who've come out and said that's not true. Loads of men have had their research published when they haven't gone through the correct peer review process. So is this is very much a case of, again, a gender and racial bias case. And I think Google have a lot of internal work to do, clearly. And it just shows you how, I guess, toxic these work environments can be. And it's a real shame, though. It's a real shame. But it's obvious that Timnit's going to go on to do amazing things with or without Google. So I think Google were really, really stupid for the way they acted. And it's a shame, because it makes you lose a bit of faith in the research that they're then going to be producing from now on. It's like, how can we trust this hasn't been tampered with? But yeah, I don't really know what Google's next steps from here will be, and how they're gonna come back from this in a respect way.
So on that note, I think we're up on our time. So yeah, we will keep you all up to date if there's any developments when we find out where Timnit will be working next, and where you can follow her work. And we will see you next week. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for tuning in, guys. And if you want to follow us on social media, we're at Let's Chat Ethics on Twitter, and also if you want to drop us an email, we're at letschatethics@gmail.com.
See you next week. Bye.
Bye.